The funeral interrupted. The morning sun rose gently over the rolling hills of Oak Ridge Memorial Cemetery, casting golden light across the manicured lawns and the rows of white stone monuments that stretched into the distance. It was one of those autumn mornings that felt almost staged by nature itself, where the crispness in the air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, and the trees stood tall in fiery shades of amber and crimson. The scene might have been beautiful to an ordinary passerby, but to the crowd gathering near the largest white canopy in the cemetery, the beauty felt cruel, almost mocking, for today was meant to be a day of grief, of final goodbyes to a woman who had once been called the heart of her family, her community, and even her city. Eleanor Whitmore, 42 years old, heir to one of the oldest fortunes in America, had died suddenly only a week earlier, and now her family and the elite of society had come together to bury her. Blacktown cars lined the narrow roads. Chauffeurs stood stiffly beside them, and television vans clustered near the gate, their satellite dishes pointing upward, ready to beam the ceremony across the nation. This was no ordinary funeral. It was an event that mixed wealth, power, and tragedy into a spectacle, and every detail had been carefully orchestrated. At the center of it all, beneath the white canopy, rested the casket itself. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, a deep mahogany polished so finely that the surface reflected the light like glass. It was adorned with fresh white roses, lilies, and orchids arranged so meticulously that they seemed to glow against the dark wood. The coffin sat on a lowering device ready for its final descent, and beside it a wooden podium had been placed for the speakers who would eulogize the deceased. Rows of white folding chairs filled with mourners surrounded the space, every seat occupied by men and women in the finest black suits and designer mourning dresses, their jewelry discreet but costly, their faces solemn but controlled. There was grief here, yes, but it was the grief of the wealthy, dignified, restrained, and always mindful of the cameras. At the front row sat the Whitmore family. Richard Whitmore, Eleanor's older brother, was positioned in the center, a tall man with sharp features and silver threaded through his dark hair. His black suit was tailored with precision, and his expression was one of practiced sorrow, his eyes occasionally glancing toward the cameras that sought to capture his grief. Beside him sat his wife, Amanda, hidden behind a veil of black lace, her posture perfect, her gloved hands folded in her lap. On Richard's other side sat Claire, their younger sister, who looked different from them in every way. Softer in her features, with eyes that brimmed with real tears that she wiped with a trembling handkerchief. And behind them all sat Patricia Whitmore, their mother, now in her 70s but still regal, her hair a silver crown, her face frozen in the kind of composure that only decades of high society could train. The atmosphere thickened when Richard rose from his chair and walked to the podium. The quiet murmurs of the crowd fell into silence, the only sound being the rustle of the autumn leaves and the faint hum of the news cameras. He placed his hands firmly on the lectern, his expression a careful mask of grief and dignity, and began to speak. His voice was steady, deep, and polished from years of boardrooms and speeches. "Friends, family, and colleagues," he began, pausing just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. "We gather here today to say goodbye to my sister, Eleanor Marie Whitmore, a woman of compassion, of generosity, of vision, a woman who touched countless lives, and whose absence leaves a void that none of us will ever truly fill." The crowd listened intently, some nodding, some quietly dabbing their eyes. Richard's words painted Eleanor as a saint, a philanthropist who had given her life to hospitals, museums, and educational programs. He recounted her charity galas, her tireless volunteer work, her decision to turn away from the family's empire of wealth to focus on humanitarian work. His voice wavered appropriately at certain moments, eliciting sniffles from the crowd. Yet while many mourners seemed genuinely moved, one figure standing at the far edge of the gathering was not convinced. Isaiah Washington stood partly hidden by the trunk of an old oak tree, his worn shopping cart full of his possessions stationed just behind him. At 54 years old, Isaiah looked older than his years. His dark skin weathered by the elements, his beard streaked with gray, his clothes mismatched and layered for warmth rather than fashion. His eyes, however, were sharp and alert, watching every movement, every gesture, every detail of the funeral with a strange intensity. He did not belong here, anyone could see that. The other mourners, dressed in wealth and elegance, stole glances at him with suspicion and disdain, though most assumed he was a vagrant who had wandered too close. But Isaiah had come here deliberately. He had seen Eleanor's obituary in an old newspaper, and something about it had stirred something in his memory. He had known her once long ago in a different life, and when he read about her sudden death, an accident, they claimed, his instincts, those old instincts he thought had been buried under years of hardship, screamed at him that something wasn't right. Now, as Richard's carefully polished eulogy echoed through the cemetery, Isaiah's doubts only deepened. The words were too smooth, too rehearsed, the grief too controlled. Richard's face showed sorrow, yes, but beneath it Isaiah caught glimpses of something colder, harder, a kind of calculation that had nothing to do with mourning. Isaiah's hands tightened on the handle of his shopping cart as he studied the casket itself, his eyes narrowing. The floral arrangements could not mask what his instincts told him. Something was wrong. The minister approached the casket now, offering prayers in solemn tones, his voice rising and falling in ritual phrases. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We commend Eleanor Whitmore to her eternal rest. The pallbearers, 6 men in black suits, stepped forward and lifted the casket to place it on the lowering device. The air shifted as the crowd rose to its feet, all eyes on the mahogany box that carried their beloved Eleanor. The mechanical hum of the lowering machine began as the casket started its slow descent into the earth, and that was when Isaiah felt it, an instinct so sharp it nearly doubled him over. It was the same instinct that had once made him a promising medical student, the same instinct that had saved lives long ago before his world had collapsed. He stepped forward, his heart pounding, his breath coming fast. His eyes locked on the casket, and he swore on everything left in his shattered life that he saw movement. Just the faintest twitch, a finger barely shifting against the silk lining, but it was enough. Stop. Isaiah's voice thundered across the cemetery, raw and desperate. She's not dead. Every head snapped toward him. The motor continued to whir for a moment before the startled funeral director released the button, freezing the casket halfway into the ground. The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Security began to move. Richard's face flushed with fury. Isaiah pushed forward, stumbling through the rows of expensive shoes and tailored suits, his voice cracking but filled with certainty. She's alive. Don't bury her. Look at her hands! I saw them move. Chaos followed instantly. Mourners gasped, some stepping back as if Isaiah's very presence was offensive. Others leaned forward, curiosity overcoming propriety. Security guards rushed to intercept him, grabbing his arms, but Isaiah struggled against them, his eyes wild. Please listen to me. Her body is too warm. Her skin isn't right. I swear she's alive. Richard's voice cut like a knife. Get him out of here, he roared, pointing at Isaiah as cameras swung toward the commotion. His fury was palpable, his control slipping. This is madness. Arrest this man. But before the guards could drag Isaiah away, Claire's voice rang out, trembling but clear. Wait, she cried, her eyes wide as she stared at the casket. She had looked, really looked, and for the briefest moment she too had seen it. The faint twitch of a finger, the suggestion of life. Her hand flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. Oh my God. Her hand moved. The silence that followed was deafening. The hospital and the shadows of truth. The ambulance tore down the wide boulevard toward St. Augustine Medical Center, its sirens echoing off the tall glass buildings that lined the city streets. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere was tense and urgent, every second a battle between life and death. Eleanor Whitmore lay strapped to the stretcher, her body pale but not lifeless, hooked up to machines that beeped in fragile rhythms. Electrodes tracked her sluggish heartbeat. Oxygen flowed through a mask pressed to her face, and IV lines dripped fluids into her veins. Her chest rose and fell in shallow movements, each breath a whisper of resistance against the silence of the grave she had nearly been sealed into. The paramedics worked swiftly, adjusting monitors, injecting stabilizing drugs, and relaying vital signs through their radios to the emergency team waiting at the hospital. The woman who had nearly been buried alive was not yet out of danger, but she was clinging to life, fragile yet undeniable. Claire sat beside the stretcher, clutching Eleanor's hand with trembling fingers. Her tears had not stopped since the cemetery, but now there was a fire in her eyes that mixed relief with horror. She could not shake the image of her sister in that casket, her skin still warm, her fingers twitching, her heart still beating faintly while the world believed her dead. The thought made her stomach twist and her eyes kept darting toward Isaiah, who sat opposite her in the cramped ambulance. His shoulders slumped, yet his gaze steady. His clothes were ragged, his beard unkempt, his presence so out of place in this sterile world of machines and uniforms, and yet he had been the only one to see what no one else dared to notice. She gripped Eleanor's hand tighter, whispering as if to both her sister and the man across from her. "You saved her. You really saved her." Isaiah said nothing at first. His eyes flickered from Eleanor to the machines, noting every irregular beat, every faint change in the monitor lines. The years of his medical training, long buried under despair and hardship, surfaced now with painful clarity. He wanted to reach forward, to adjust the IV drip, to check her pupils, to do what he had once been trained to do. But he held himself back. He was not a doctor anymore. He had no license, no authority, nothing but instincts and memories that had nearly been drowned under years of failure. Still, he could not look away. "She's not safe yet," he finally murmured, his voice low and steady. "She needs more than we can give here. They have to get her into ICU immediately." The lead paramedic, a woman with iron-gray hair who radiated calm authority, glanced at him. There was no time to question who he was or why he spoke with such certainty. Right now, every second mattered. She nodded once. "That's where she's going." "Hold on, ma'am, we're almost there," she said to Claire, then returned to her work. When the ambulance doors burst open at the hospital entrance, the team waiting inside swept Eleanor into their care with swift, practiced movements. Doctors and nurses surrounded the stretcher, their voices sharp with commands and readings. "BP 60/40. Heart rate 32. We're losing saturation. Prep dopamine infusion. Intubate if necessary." The medical staff worked like a machine, their years of training manifesting in seamless coordination. Within moments, Eleanor was rushed through the sliding glass doors of the emergency wing, leaving Claire and Isaiah standing stunned in the fluorescent-lit waiting area. For Claire, the chaos was overwhelming. Reporters had already gathered outside the hospital, shouting questions, their cameras flashing as security tried to hold them back. She pressed a hand to her face, trying to gather herself, her entire body trembling with adrenaline and fear. Her sister was alive, but how close had they come to burying her alive? The thought was unbearable. She turned to Isaiah, who stood silently, his shopping cart existence written in every threadbare layer of his clothes. Yet his eyes still held the same sharpness that had stopped the funeral. He looked weary, almost fragile, yet also steady in a way she could not ignore. "Why did you come to the funeral?" Claire asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence between them. It was not an accusation, but a question heavy with need. She wanted to understand how this man, who looked like he had nothing, had been the one to save everything. Isaiah hesitated, then ran a rough hand over his beard. His voice came out low, almost hoarse. "I saw the obituary. I remembered her name. Eleanor helped me once, years ago, when no one else would. I owed her, at least to be there." His gaze drifted toward the doors through which the doctors had vanished with Eleanor, and I knew something wasn't right. It didn't add up. People don't just die like that. Not someone as healthy as she was. My instincts told me I had to see for myself. Claire studied him, her mind racing. There was a raw honesty in his words, something unpolished and uncalculated, unlike the speeches she had grown up hearing in her family's world. He was a man who had nothing to gain, yet he had risked humiliation, even arrest, to speak the truth. Before she could respond, a doctor in a white coat approached them, pulling off his gloves with an expression that was both grim and cautious. "She's alive," he said, and Claire let out a sob of relief, covering her mouth. "But she's in critical condition. We've stabilized her heartbeat, though it's still dangerously low, and she's on a ventilator to support her breathing. Her blood pressure remains unstable, but we're doing everything we can." Claire nodded quickly, wiping her tears, desperate for more information. "What happened to her? Why did she look dead?" The doctor's expression tightened, and he glanced around before lowering his voice. "We ran preliminary blood tests. There are high levels of barbiturates in her system, enough to induce a state that could easily be mistaken for death by anyone not doing a full examination. To put it plainly, she was drugged, heavily. If it weren't for the interruption today, she would have been buried alive." The word struck Claire like a blow. She staggered back, clutching the edge of a chair for support. Her mind reeled, her grief colliding with horror. "Drugged?" she whispered, shaking her head. That means someone did this to her. Someone tried to Her voice trailed off as the realization sank in. This was not an accident. It had never been an accident. Isaiah's jaw tightened as he listened. The confirmation of what his instincts had screamed now became undeniable. They wanted her gone, he said quietly, his voice heavy with certainty. They wanted it to look natural, an accident, nothing suspicious. But they didn't count on her body fighting back, or on me seeing it. His words carried no pride, only a grim acknowledgement of the truth. Claire turned to him again, her eyes shining with tears and fire. Why would someone want her dead? She was kind, she gave to everyone. Who could? She stopped herself, her mind already racing to the faces she knew best. Her family. Her brother Richard, his cold anger at the funeral, his insistence that Isaiah be silenced, his refusal to even check the body. She thought of Amanda, her perfect composure behind the veil, her icy dismissal of Isaiah's cries. She thought even of her mother, Patricia, stoic and controlled, who had always cared more for appearances than for truth. The questions swirled like storm clouds inside her, but she said nothing yet. The doctor excused himself, leaving them in the waiting room, the weight of his words lingering heavily. Claire sank into a chair, her hands trembling, while Isaiah remained standing, his arms crossed, his gaze distant. For years he had been invisible, overlooked by the very society that now swirled in chaos because of what he had seen, and yet here he was, pulled back into the world of the powerful by a truth too urgent to be ignored. Claire finally broke the silence. You said she helped you once. Tell me. Her voice was softer now, almost pleading. Tell me why you were the only one who could see what was happening today. Isaiah's eyes flickered with pain. He hesitated, as though speaking would reopen wounds long buried, but then he nodded slowly. It's a long story, he said quietly. But you deserve to know. Because this wasn't just chance. If your sister is alive today, it's because of something that happened years ago. Something I've never forgotten. And with that, Isaiah began to tell her about the man he had once been, about the life he had lost, and about the one moment of kindness that had tethered him to hope long enough to stand at Eleanor Whitmore's funeral and stop her from being buried alive. Isaiah's past in the conspiracy awakens. The waiting room of St. Augustine Medical Center was quiet now, except for the low hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional beep of monitors drifting from distant hallways. Claire sat opposite Isaiah at a small table, her hands folded tightly as if to anchor herself in the chaos that had overtaken her life. Only hours earlier she had believed her sister dead and buried. Now Eleanor clung to life in the intensive care unit, and everything Claire thought she knew about her family and the world around her had begun to unravel. Across from her sat the man who had pulled the threads loose, a homeless stranger who had stood against wealth, power and appearances to declare the unthinkable truth. Isaiah leaned back in his chair, his posture weary, his eyes heavy with the weight of old memories. He had eaten the sandwich Claire brought him earlier, but it had done little to ease the hollowness that years of hunger and hardship had carved into his body. Still his gaze remained sharp, locked on Claire as if deciding how much of himself he could bear to reveal. She waited patiently, her tear-stained face softened by something new. Trust. My name is Isaiah Washington, he began, his voice rough but steady, carrying the gravity of confession. A long time ago I was a medical resident at County General. Emergency medicine. I was good at it, at least I thought I was. I wanted to be the kind of doctor who could save anyone, anywhere, under any conditions. I believed that knowledge and training could protect people from death itself, if only you paid close enough attention. He paused, the corner of his mouth twitching in something between a smile and a grimace. But medicine has a way of humbling you. Claire leaned forward slightly, her hands tightening in her lap. She sensed he needed to tell it all, even if it hurt. Isaiah continued, his voice dropping lower. One night, a teenage boy came into the ER. Sports injury, nothing major, or so I thought. He had abdominal pain, but he was young, strong, seemed stable. I examined him, ran some quick tests, gave him pain medication, and sent him home with instructions to rest. 3 days later, he died. Internal bleeding. A small tear in his spleen I should have caught. They called it a mistake, but to me it was more than that. It was failure. The kind that breaks you. The words hung heavy in the sterile air. Claire's throat tightened, but she said nothing, sensing more to come. The family sued. The hospital investigated. They said I missed obvious signs. Maybe they were right. I was dragged through depositions, reviews, hearings, and while all that was happening, my daughter got sick. His voice cracked on the word daughter, and he stopped, pressing his knuckles against his lips as if the act of speaking her name out loud would undo him. After a moment, he continued, softer this time. Emma, 8 years old, leukemia. We caught it early, but treatment was brutal. Chemo, hospital stays, transfusions. She never complained, not once. She was braver than I ever was. But the treatments were expensive, and with the lawsuit, I couldn't work. I tried to fight for her, tried to hold on, but 6 months later, she was gone. And 3 months after that, my wife left, said she couldn't look at me anymore without seeing everything we had lost. And maybe she was right. I couldn't look in the mirror either. Claire pressed a hand to her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks. She wanted to reach across the table to touch his arm, but she held back, afraid of breaking the fragile strength it had taken him to speak. I lost everything, Isaiah said simply. My license, my family, my home. I drifted for years trying to survive. Some nights in shelters, some under bridges, some in parks. Eventually I stopped being Isaiah Washington, the doctor, the husband, the father. I became the man no one wanted to see. He fell silent, the story spent, but Claire could still see the weight of it pressing against his chest. She took a shaky breath. And Eleanor? You said she helped you? A faint light flickered in Isaiah's eyes, not joy but something like gratitude remembered. 15 years ago, I worked as a volunteer at the Mercy Street Clinic downtown. I couldn't practice medicine, but I could do intake, basic first aid paperwork. It gave me something to hold on to. Then one day, a newspaper ran a story about me. Dug up the malpractice case, Emma's death, everything. They implied I was dangerous, that the clinic was reckless for letting me near patients. The director was going to fire me. He didn't want to, but donations were already dropping. That's when Eleanor walked in. Claire's breath caught. She remembered Mercy Street. Eleanor had spoken of it often, calling it one of the most important things she had ever funded. Isaiah's voice softened. She came right up to me in front of everyone and asked me to tell her what happened. So I did. Every word, just like I told you now. When I finished, she turned to the director and said if I was fired, she would pull all her funding. She told him everyone deserved a second chance. That compassion wasn't conditional. That my past didn't erase my knowledge or my worth. She defended me when no one else would. Because of her, I stayed. Because of her, I had a place to belong, at least for a while. For the first time since the cemetery, Isaiah's voice faltered not from grief, but from something gentler. That's who your sister was. She didn't just write checks. She looked at people, really looked, and saw the human being under the ruin. When I saw her obituary, I couldn't believe it. And when I stood at her funeral, I knew I owed her the same thing she gave me, the chance to live when everyone else had given up. Claire's tears flowed freely now. She rose from her chair and, without hesitation, crossed the space between them. She placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch light but steady. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. You saved her. You saved my sister, and I believe you. For Isaiah, the words cut deeper than she could have known. Years of invisibility, of being dismissed as a vagrant, a failure, a ghost haunting the edges of society, washed away by her simple acknowledgement. For a moment, the burden of shame lifted, replaced by something fragile but real. Dignity. The door opened suddenly, and Richard entered the waiting room with Amanda close behind him. His face was composed but tense, his eyes sharp as they immediately locked on Isaiah and Claire. What's he still doing here? Richard demanded, his voice cold. This circus should have ended at the cemetery. Eleanor's condition is being handled by professionals. We don't need the ramblings of a derelict confusing things further. Claire turned on him, her grief hardening into anger. He saved her life, Richard. If it weren't for him, Eleanor would be in the ground right now. You should be thanking him, not insulting him. Richard's jaw tightened, but his gaze didn't waver. We don't know what his motives are. Men like him see opportunity in chaos. Maybe he's hoping for a payout. Or maybe he wants to drag our family name through the mud for attention. Don't be naive, Claire. Amanda's voice joined his, smooth and icy. This family has enough enemies without inviting more into our lives. Eleanor's survival is a miracle, yes, but miracles don't erase reality. This man has no place here. Claire's fists clenched at her sides. Reality? She snapped. Reality is that Eleanor was drugged, Richard. The doctors confirmed it. Someone wanted her dead, and you seem more interested in silencing the one person who saved her than in finding out who tried to kill her. Why is that? The word struck like a blow, and for the briefest moment something flickered in Richard's eyes. A flash of unease quickly buried beneath his controlled mask. He straightened his shoulders. You're upset. You don't know what you're saying. But I won't allow this vagabond to poison this family further. When this is over, I want him gone. He turned sharply and strode out, Amanda following close behind. Claire stood trembling, fury and fear swirling in her chest. She turned back to Isaiah, who remained calm despite the confrontation. His eyes, however, held the same warning she felt in her own heart. He knows something, Isaiah said quietly. Your brother. He knows more than he's saying. Claire swallowed hard, her mind racing. She thought of the family's fortune, the Whitmore Foundation, and the fact that Eleanor, as the eldest daughter, had the largest stake in both. Her sudden death would have shifted control and billions of dollars straight into Richard's hands. The pieces began to align, but the picture they formed was almost too terrible to accept. Eleanor had been drugged, buried alive, saved only by a homeless man who owed her a debt of compassion, and now, the shadow of conspiracy loomed over the Whitmore family itself, and Claire knew, with a clarity that burned through her grief, that the truth would not remain buried. Not anymore. Truth against power. The night fell heavily over St. Augustine Medical Center, its tall glass walls reflecting the neon glow of the city beyond. Inside, the sterile corridors buzzed with the subdued urgency of doctors and nurses moving between patients, their footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors. The ICU was hushed, save for the rhythmic beeping of machines and the occasional murmur of medical staff checking vitals. In one of the rooms, Eleanor Whitmore lay motionless, her fragile body still bound by tubes and wires, her chest rising and falling with the aid of a ventilator. Though her pulse was faint, it was steady now, and that fragile rhythm had become the line between life and death. Claire sat at her sister's bedside, her hand clasping Eleanor's limp fingers as if willing strength into them. The room smelled of antiseptic, but beneath it lingered the faint trace of the flowers that friends and well-wishers had sent, now wilting in their vases. Claire's eyes were red from crying, but within them burned a determination that grief alone could not fuel. She remembered Isaiah's words from earlier. They wanted her gone, and they had burrowed into her thoughts like a seed of fire. Someone had drugged Eleanor, someone close enough to stage her death and nearly succeed in burying her alive. The list of those who stood to gain was painfully short, and at the top of it was her brother Richard. When Claire finally left the ICU to clear her head, she found Isaiah waiting in the corridor. He had refused to leave the hospital, though security had tried more than once to push him out. His presence unsettled the Whitmore staff and family, but Claire had defended him each time, insisting he stay. Now, as she approached him, she saw the fatigue etched deep into his face, but also the quiet strength that had carried him through years of hardship. He looked at her as though he already knew what was weighing on her mind. You think it's him? Isaiah said softly, his voice carrying not accusation but certainty. Claire didn't ask who he meant. Richard, she whispered, glancing around to be sure no one overheard. If Eleanor had been buried, everything would have passed to him. The foundation, the businesses, the estate. He stood to gain everything, and he didn't even hesitate to try to silence you at the funeral.
He knew. He must have known.
Isaiah folded his arms, leaning against the wall. His clothes were worn, his shoes frayed. Yet in that moment he carried himself with the gravity of a man who understood the weight of truth. We can't prove it yet, he said. Not without evidence. Right now all we have are suspicions. If you accuse him without proof, he'll turn the whole family and the press against you. He's powerful, Claire. Powerful men don't fall without a fight. Claire swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had grown up in this world of money and power, but she had never understood how ruthless it could be until now. She looked at Isaiah, her voice trembling with desperation. Then help me, please. You saw what no one else did. You've lived outside the walls my family hides behind. You know how to look where others won't. I need you. If Eleanor survives, if she wakes up, I want her to come back to a world where the truth is known. Not a world where Richard buries everything again. For a long moment, Isaiah said nothing. He thought of the years he had spent invisible, ignored, dismissed as a vagrant with nothing to offer. Yet here was a woman of wealth and privilege asking him to stand with her, to fight alongside her. to use the instincts he thought he had buried forever. He nodded slowly. Then we start with what we know. Eleanor was drugged. Whoever did it had access to her home, her routines. That narrows the circle. Together they began to piece the puzzle. Isaiah asked questions, his voice low and precise. Who was with her the night she died? Who last saw her alive? Who arranged the medical report that declared her death? Who pushed for the quick funeral? Each question sliced deeper, peeling back the layers of carefully arranged appearances. Claire's answers revealed a disturbing pattern. Richard had handled nearly everything. The private doctor who signed the death certificate, the funeral arrangements made with unusual speed, the press statements crafted to deflect questions. Amanda had been at his side throughout, her composure chilling in retrospect. Patricia, their mother, had accepted it all without resistance, though whether from shock or complicity Claire could not yet tell. Isaiah leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Your brother didn't just benefit from Eleanor's death, he orchestrated it. But something went wrong. Maybe the dosage wasn't enough. Maybe her body fought harder than expected, but she survived long enough for me to see it. Claire shivered at his words, her stomach twisting. She thought of her brother's face at the funeral. The flash of rage when Isaiah shouted. The desperate way he had tried to have him dragged out before anyone could look. It all fit together now, too neatly to ignore. As the night deepened, Claire and Isaiah retreated to a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the empty tables. Claire sipped at a cup of untouched coffee, her hands shaking slightly. Isaiah sat across from her, his cart left outside under the watch of a sympathetic nurse. For the first time in years, he felt as though the knowledge inside him mattered again. He was not a ghost drifting through the city. He was a man standing at the center of a storm. What happens if we're right? Claire asked suddenly, her voice heavy with dread. What happens if we prove Richard tried to kill her? The scandal alone would destroy the family. The businesses, the foundation, it would all collapse. Isaiah's gaze was steady. Then maybe it should. If Eleanor lives, she deserves to know who tried to take her life. And if she dies, she deserves justice. Either way, the truth matters more than the empire your brother is trying to protect. Claire looked at him, and for the first time she saw not a homeless man but the doctor he had once been, the man Eleanor had believed in. Her chest tightened with something that felt almost like hope, fragile and dangerous. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed sharply on the table. She picked it up, her eyes scanning the message that had just arrived. The blood drained from her face. It's from the hospital staff, she whispered. Someone tried to access Eleanor's room, a man. He used my brother's security clearance. Isaiah straightened instantly, his eyes flashing with alarm. Then it's worse than we thought. He's not just waiting for her to die. He's trying to make sure she never wakes up. Claire's hand trembled as she set the phone down. The reality of it washed over her in a wave of icy fear. This wasn't just about inheritance or control. It was about silencing Eleanor forever, erasing her voice, erasing the truth she carried. Isaiah rose from his seat, his posture taut with purpose. Then we don't have time to waste. We have to get ahead of him. We have to find proof, something undeniable. Because if we don't, your brother will bury her again, one way or another. Claire nodded, her eyes blazing now with the same fire that had fueled her sister's life. For the first time, she felt the strength to stand against her family, to fight not just for Eleanor but for the truth itself. And beside her stood Isaiah, a man society had cast aside, now stepping into the light of a battle that would test them both. The conspiracy had begun to unravel, but the war for truth was only beginning. Justice and redemption. The night bled slowly into morning at St. Augustine Medical Center, the sky outside shifting from inky black to the pale gray of dawn. Inside, the ICU was hushed but tense, the steady beeping of monitors marking the fragile line that still tethered Eleanor Whitmore to the living. For Claire, the long hours by her sister's bedside felt endless. She had barely slept, her hand never leaving Eleanor's. Somewhere inside her chest, she believed that Eleanor could feel her presence, that even through the haze of sedation and shallow breaths, the bond of sisterhood held fast. But beneath her hope ran a river of fear, for the danger had not passed. Whoever had tried to silence Eleanor once would surely try again. Isaiah sat nearby, his weary frame slouched in the corner chair, though his eyes remained alert. Sleep did not come easily to him. Years on the streets had taught him to rest lightly, to wake at the sound of footsteps or shifting shadows. Now in the sterile quiet of the hospital, those instincts returned with sharp clarity. He studied every face that passed through the corridor, every nurse who entered the room, every flicker of movement beyond the glass walls. He knew the threat was still near, and the only thing keeping it at bay was vigilance. As dawn broke, Claire excused herself to step outside the ICU for a brief meeting with hospital security. She wanted extra precautions placed around Eleanor's room. Guards at the door, cameras checked, visitor lists monitored. Isaiah accompanied her, and together they walked down the polished hallway toward the administrative wing. The two of them looked like an unlikely pair, the disheveled homeless man whose life had been stripped bare, and the poised heiress whose grief had transformed into fury. But there was a strange harmony between them now, born of shared truth. The head of security, a broad-shouldered man with a clipped tone, agreed to their requests but warned them of the political storm already brewing outside. "The media's eating this up," he said, glancing between them. "Homeless man saves billionaire philanthropist from being buried alive. It's everywhere. Papers, TV, the internet. The Whitmore name is on every headline. That means scrutiny, and scrutiny means pressure. Whoever wanted her dead won't stop. They'll push harder because if she wakes up, she'll have the chance to speak." Claire's stomach tightened. She glanced at Isaiah, who gave the faintest nod. He already knew it. He had known it from the moment he saw Eleanor's fingers twitch inside the coffin. This wasn't just about money, it was about control, about power built on silence. Later that morning, while Eleanor remained in critical but stable condition, Claire and Isaiah began combing through documents and reports in the hospital's family waiting suite. Claire had used her family's influence to request copies of Eleanor's estate files, the foundation's latest board minutes, and medical records from the private physician who had declared Eleanor dead. The more they read, the darker the picture became. It was Isaiah who spotted the first crack. His eyes, trained long ago to catch details that others missed, lingered on a death certificate signed by Dr. Lowell, a physician whose name meant nothing to him. "Look at this," he said, pointing at the time of death listed. He claimed she died at 10:15 that night, but according to these phone logs, Richard called the funeral home at 10:30. That's 15 minutes later.
Funerals don't get arranged at that speed unless someone was ready.
Too ready. Claire leaned over the papers, her heart thundering as she began to see it too. Richard had everything prepared. He was waiting for the death to be declared. He wanted it over before anyone could ask questions. Then came the bank records, wire transfers from accounts tied to Richard's businesses, large sums routed through shell corporations, funneled eventually into accounts connected to the private physician. Bribes, payments disguised as consulting fees, evidence that spoke louder than words. Claire stared at the numbers in disbelief, her hands trembling. He paid him. Richard paid the doctor to falsify her death. Isaiah's jaw tightened. That's the proof we need. It's not just suspicion anymore. It's fact, but proof was dangerous. If Richard discovered they had it, he would do anything to destroy it. And Isaiah knew from the way Richard had looked at him at the funeral, eyes full of rage, a predator caught in the act, that the man was desperate enough to kill again. Their fears proved justified when, that evening, someone tried to enter Eleanor's ICU room once more. The attempt was stopped by security, but the intruder slipped away before being caught. The cameras showed only a shadowy figure in a mask, moving with precision, slipping through staff corridors. Claire's blood ran cold as she watched the grainy footage. Isaiah said nothing, but the fire in his eyes burned brighter. This wasn't over. Not until Richard himself was exposed. The turning point came 2 days later. Eleanor's condition improved enough that doctors began reducing her sedation. Her heart rate climbed slowly but steadily. Her blood pressure stabilized and faint reflexes flickered in her hands and eyelids. Claire clung to those signs as to a lifeline. "She's fighting," she whispered to Isaiah as they stood at her bedside. "She's coming back." And with her awakening came the looming threat. Richard had grown restless, his visits to the hospital laced with icy tension. He stood at the foot of Eleanor's bed, his face a mask of brotherly concern, but his eyes betrayed unease whenever Claire or Isaiah were near. He knew time was running out. The final confrontation erupted sooner than anyone expected. Claire had arranged a meeting with the Foundation's legal counsel, bringing with her the documents she and Isaiah had uncovered: the death certificate anomalies, the bank transfers, the phone logs. She intended to force the issue, to expose Richard before Eleanor awoke and could be silenced again. But Richard arrived at the meeting uninvited, his presence towering like a storm cloud. "You've overstepped, Claire," he said coldly, his voice echoing in the boardroom. "You're letting that vagrant poison your mind with paranoia. Whatever nonsense you think you've found, it won't hold up. And when this is over, you'll regret dragging the family name through the mud." Claire rose from her chair, her hands trembling but her voice strong. "This isn't paranoia. We have proof, Richard. You paid to have her death staged. You bribed a doctor. You tried to bury her alive. And now everyone is going to see it." She pushed the files across the table, the papers spilling open like a wound. Richard's mask cracked. For a moment his face twisted with something raw: rage, fear, desperation. He slammed his hand down on the table, leaning forward until his shadow loomed over her. "Do you think anyone will believe a homeless man and a grieving sister over me? I am the Whitmore name. I am the Empire. You're nothing without me." Before Claire could reply, another voice broke the silence, faint but steady. "That's where you're wrong." The room froze. Slowly, all eyes turned to the doorway. Eleanor stood there, pale and frail, supported by two nurses, but her eyes burned with the clarity of life returned. Her voice was weak, but it carried with it the authority of truth. "I am the Whitmore name. And you tried to kill me, Richard." The shock was electric. Richard staggered back, his face drained of color. Claire rushed to her sister's side, tears spilling down her cheeks while Isaiah remained still, watching the unraveling of a man who had believed himself untouchable. The fallout was swift and merciless. The evidence Claire and Isaiah had gathered, combined with Eleanor's testimony, tore through Richard's empire like wildfire. The press descended in a frenzy. The authorities launched an investigation, and Richard was led away in handcuffs, his face twisted with the fury of a man who had lost everything. Amanda disappeared from public view, her silence confirming complicity. Patricia, the matriarch, sat in quiet devastation, her carefully composed dignity shattering as the truth of her son's betrayal filled the headlines. But amid the chaos, there was light. Eleanor recovered slowly but steadily, her voice gaining strength each day. She thanked Isaiah personally, her gratitude fierce and unyielding. "You gave me back my life," she whispered to him. "I won't forget it." For Isaiah, the words were more than gratitude, they were redemption. The man who had once lost everything had found purpose again. The mistakes of his past did not vanish, but they no longer defined him. He was no longer invisible. He had been seen, believed, and trusted, and in saving Eleanor, he had, in some way, saved himself. Months later, when the storm of scandal had settled and the Whitmore Foundation had been rebuilt under Eleanor's guidance, Claire invited Isaiah to a small gathering in the city. It was not a gala or a press event, but a dinner with Eleanor, Claire, and a handful of people who had stood by them through the ordeal. Isaiah arrived hesitantly, still wearing the clothes of a man accustomed to the streets, but when Eleanor greeted him with an embrace, he realized he belonged. The night ended quietly with laughter and warmth, and as Isaiah walked back through the city streets, he felt something he had not felt in years: peace. His life was not perfect, and the scars of his past would never fully fade, but he had stepped out of the shadows. He had spoken when no one else dared, and in doing so he had saved a life, uncovered the truth, and reminded the world that sometimes the people society overlooks are the very ones who carry the courage to see what others refuse to see. And as the city lights glowed against the night sky, Isaiah allowed himself a smile. For the first time in decades, he believed again, not just in redemption but in himself.